Good afternoon, everyone. Come on. There we go. All right. For those who don't know me, I'm Jeff McClurkin. I'm a professor of history and American studies and special advisor to the UMW president, President Payno. It's my pleasure to give an official welcome. I know that those of you here for DPLI have already gotten well into the things that you're working on today, but this is an official welcome from the University of Mary Washington. Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute, created by Sean and by Jesse, and hybrid pedagogy. I'm incredibly grateful to have DPL here for the second year, and I hope that we continue to be able to provide a home for DPL in the years to come. For me, Digital Pedagogy Lab in this building at this school seems like such an obvious fit. And it's something that Jesse and I talked about in the sort of first days of his career here. The other piece of my job that I haven't been explicit about is that I supervise as much as anyone can Jesse Stommel. I spend a lot of time doing that. I have other jobs too, but. So I know that Sean and Jesse and the keynoters and the instructors and the fellows and the team here at UMW and our Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies have put together an amazing week of pedagogy and of conversation, of networking and of caring, an energizing chance for us to build the learning that we all know is possible, right? I'm incredibly excited to have nearly 20 Mary Washington faculty and staff joining 90 of you from around the globe. And I'm also grateful to Virtually Connecting for bringing in more of the world. For those who can't be with us this week, I might actually even get pulled in to be part of Virtually Connecting. I know Maha is giving me, yeah, all right. This is a long-standing thing that they've been trying to pull me in, and maybe this week. But in any case, it's going to be a terrific time. Officially, welcome from the University of Mary Washington to the Digital Pedagogy Lab Institute. And with that, I will turn things over to Sean Michael Morris to introduce the Institute's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Jeff. Loud. So I want to, I promised you this morning that there would be a laundry list of thank yous. So here we go. So first of all, I want to make really clear that this event would not be possible without the incredible support of the University of Mary Washington. But I can't really just leave it at that. You think of it as just, hey, an institution is housing us kind of thing. But it's frankly too important to recognize the very unique space that UMW has made for us. Not just this amazing facility, but this is an amazing facility. And not just the giant support of the genius staff at the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies. The space that's been made for us here is full of potential and it's full of risk. Because Digital Pedagogy Lab makes room for discussions that are not generally had in higher education, and because the voices here are not the usual voices, it isn't easy for an institution to step forward and welcome an event like this, much less offer logistical, financial, and ideological support for that work. The University of Mary Washington has unflinchingly welcomed this event 2 years in a row, for which I'm very grateful. There are many individuals who I need to thank. Thank you to Jeff McClurkin, Special Advisor to President at UMW, whose abiding interest in this event has fueled our welcome here. Also to the UMW Provost and President, who have been active supporters of this work. And thank you to the staff of the DTLT, Jess Reingold, Nigel Harstead, Chris Schaffer, and Martha Burtis, and the student assistants who have shown up at all hours to make this event run smoothly. Thank you to Steph, Bethany, and Jen. Special thanks to Cartland Burge, the Hurley Convergent Center building manager, for his patience as we have thrown more and more moving parts into this event. Oh, there's the thing. I'm just going to do it this way. That was supposed to be there. Okay. I also want to thank some folks who have provided support for scholarships and fellowships for this event. Digital Pedagogy Lab is part of Hybrid Pedagogy Incorporated, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And like I said this morning, we don't have a lot of resources. And so there are some individuals who have stepped forward to offer help to basically not only support this event, but also to help get people here. And so I wanted to call out some of those folks. Whitney Kilgore is an individual who's a long supporter of digital pedagogy in various forms. She donated enough for a full scholarship. R.L. Widman has donated enough for 3 scholarships for these events. And this includes both this event and the Vancouver event that we did, last week. Also, Pedagogy Web Stuff, which is the company of our friend Pat Lockley in England. You can find him at Pedagogy on Twitter. He also donated a full scholarship, and very specially, Sara Goldrick-Rab, who donated her speaking fee so that we could actually bring 2 more people. And with that, it is my honor to introduce Sara Goldrick-Rab. It's time for universal public higher education. Sara Goldrick-Rab wrote that in a 2016 New York Times editorial. It's a short piece, but its determined, clear perspective is one that demands attention. Laying bare some simple facts about college affordability, about which most of us are aware. College is too expensive, student loan debt burdens learners for years or decades after they graduate, but she draws conclusions that are braver than most people who face those same facts. Sara writes, lowering prices for students is just the start. It also comes with shared responsibility for funding higher education and ensuring quality. It helps students focus on learning rather than working, so they complete degrees faster and have acquired more skills, having acquired more skills. Best of all, it recognizes that ability to pay is not a marker of talent in America, unleashing the potential in us all. The price of college is a social justice issue, and one that we as teachers, administrators, instructional designers, and technologists must not only be aware of, but which we must acknowledge professionally and pedagogically. The cost of college is not just a monthly bill. It is the price tag that guards the gate to learning. For many of our students, the cost of college can be a burden so great that it imperils not only their learning, but their ability to house themselves and feed themselves as well. More often than you think, the faces staring back at you, or the faces the LMS hides from you, are contending with issues of survival, while also hoping to earn a passing grade. Sara has written on education issues for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. She is a recipient of the Early Career Award from the American Educational Research Association. The Atlantic, Slate, and NPR have covered her work, and she has appeared on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. She is also the founder of the Wisconsin Hope Lab, the nation's first research laboratory aimed at making college affordable. In 2017, the Hope Lab released Hungry and Homeless in College, a new research report on food and housing insecurity among students at 70 community colleges in 24 states. Again, the price of college is a social justice issue, and I don't know anyone who has made this a clearer argument than Sara has. Sara Goldrick-Rab demands attention, but not because she's forceful, not because she's going to overwhelm you with statistics and facts. She demands attention because her vision is clear, and it is her compassion that drives her research. When she speaks, we hear her determination, her formidable intelligence, and her resonant humanity. Please welcome Sara Goldrick-Rab.
Before I start, thank you so much. Wow. Oh, that's me? That's pretty awesome. I think my daughter would really like that. She's, okay. All right, so I'm assuming my slides are beyond that. Oh, well, thank you. It was a great invitation from Sean and Jesse, but I didn't really know all that it would mean, especially to come to Mary Washington. I'm from Virginia, from Northern Virginia. I had a great chat last night with some folks who went to the same high school as me and such, but I had never been here, and it's especially great because it's clear that Jesse's found a home, that this work has found a home. And for those of you who haven't experienced being in a place that is not really your home, but lays claim to you as its employer, it's not a pleasant and it's not a productive and it's not a hospitable experience. So I'm really glad that you found a home. I'm very glad to have traveled down here in a very short train ride from Temple University where I found a home. And I'm happy to be able to speak with you all today about a couple of issues that are very near and dear to my heart right now. I thought I would start today, though, by talking about our students and some of the portrayals of our students out there in the media. I recently saw this, and you're all taking a good look, where it's from. You told me I have a little thing, right? Does it go like that? Sort of works? Let's see. Does that work? I have to hold it there. There you go. That's where it's from. Okay. Just a highlight. So, of course, not all of our students are millennials, right? If you don't know about what's happening at our nation's community colleges, Macomb's here. A lot of our students, yes, Macomb's pretty awesome. The community colleges are pretty awesome. The average age of our students has dropped a little bit in the last several years. It's now closer to the mid-20s. It was closer to 28, 29 before. But that's still the case that the very large number of our students are represented by this word, this image, and they're being cast in a certain kind of light. I'm an evidence-driven person. I like data. And what I'm going to turn to next will seem a bit of a contrast from this image here because I've been learning about these folks up close and personal. And so I want to start by introducing you to one of them. If you've read the book, you know Chloe Johnson. Chloe Johnson's changed my entire life, changed the lives of my research team in many ways for all that she taught us. Chloe was a 18-year-old woman from rural Wisconsin, a couple hours north of Madison when we first met her. And Chloe was sitting across from a table in the lunchroom with me when we started to talk about college. She had only been to a few classes at that point, so I wasn't really going to ask her that much yet about what she was studying because it was very new to her. All I really wanted to know when I first met Chloe was, what is it like to be in college and why are you here? Very simple, straightforward questions. And Chloe shared that she had a sense that it was the thing you did these days. And this is very much the world I think our millennials are growing up in. College is what you do. College is an expectation. It's not necessarily an expectation, though, for the reasons that are being framed out of the media, reasons that have to do with a desire to be rich and famous, a desire to get ahead, to be upwardly mobile, okay? It has to do with what Chloe referred to as a desire for a decent job and a decent life, something that feels fair, something that she described would feel stable. The reason that Chloe and so many people like her are looking for a decent life and a stable life is because the world is profoundly unstable right now. Chloe experienced that firsthand when her parents split up as she neared completion of high school. She also experienced it firsthand as the paper mill in her town, which is the economic driver of that little town's engine, closed. She just wanted some security and some sense there'd be something in the future, and that's what brought her to college. Now, a few weeks after interviewing Chloe Johnson, another member of my team interviewed a woman named Alicia. Alicia grew up not in rural Wisconsin, but in Milwaukee. But Alicia spoke, even coming from a very different place, frankly, than Chloe did. Alicia spoke in many similar ways to Chloe about what she wanted from college. In contrast to Chloe, she was sitting at a public research university in a large urban city. And she described her reasons as, again, not wanting to be somebody who had a fancy house or a fancy car or a lavish lifestyle, but just to simply have a better life than her mother had had so far. You can see from her quote that she emphasizes wanting to be able to be on her own 2 feet. Okay. This is a lot about what college is about. It's about getting your footing. It's about being able to be financially independent and not have to lean on other people. Nima, who attended the same college that Chloe did, she expressed some similar sentiments, but she complicated the story a little bit. Like so many people in this country, Nima is an immigrant. She comes from a family that was fortunate enough to win the immigration lottery in Nepal when she was a child. She described that as the best day of her life. But not everybody in Nima's family, of course, could come to this country. And not everything, by the way, about her immigration experience was as she had hoped. She was currently living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 brothers, her parents, and her grandmother. Okay, she did not have a room with a door to close at night. Nonetheless, she thought it was amazing that she had come to this country, and what she wanted from college, again, I think you can see from the quote, was not just to be able to afford her own decent life, but also to be able to fund the lives of those who were with her, both in this country and back in Nepal. Again, it was about far more than any one individual. This is what the data show us about today's millennial college students, but these are the words that we often hear uttered about them. I just want you to take a good hard look at those and think about how you would feel if that's how you were being described, and if these were the images and things that your teachers were hearing about you before you even walked in the door of the classroom. It's said that effective pedagogy requires understanding the learner, all about the learner, both the parts you can see and the parts you know nothing about. What we do know about the issues I'm going to talk about today are some very simple, sort of stylized facts. We hear about student debt. We hear about skyrocketing prices in college, in particular, skyrocketing tuition. You might have heard the phrase that college costs are out of control. So basically what we know is that people find college to be expensive and that a lot of students are ending up in debt. If you read the papers, what you probably think about when you think about debt, though, are these 6-figure sums that people are walking around with that they cannot afford to repay. What the media doesn't tell you is that very, very few people who are actually struggling to repay debt have $200,000 of debt or even $100,000 of debt because they weren't in college long enough to get it. Okay? The people who are most struggling today don't make for great New York Times stories because they're confusing to the average reader. They have, say, $2,000, $3,000, maybe $5,000 of debt. So debt isn't the real story. The real story is the fact that they didn't get very far in college and nonetheless have that debt. But nevertheless, we see these stories about high prices and about debt, and we think we know what that means, right? We think we know the root causes. It's amazing to me, traveling the country for the last year, talking about college affordability, how many stories we all have to tell ourselves about why college costs what it does. We also have so many stories that we tell ourselves about why students are struggling to pay for it, or whether they are in fact really struggling, or maybe there are other things going on. So I've been told stories about those lazy, entitled millennials who can't really afford these prices because they're not willing to work while they're in college. Okay? I've been told stories, I'm sure you've heard, about why college is so expensive. Well, it's because the faculty are getting paid so much. Just can't help but laugh, right? Or the fancy buildings, a little more complicated, right? But overall, it's really amazing, literally, how many narratives we have constructed. I think those narratives are doing us and our students a real disservice, right? And so part of what I've tried to do is to dig deeper and get to the root of what's really going on so that those stories no longer distract us. Now, unfortunately, I'm up against some serious opposition who want to portray a very different portrait of the world. How many of you are familiar with either of those books? Okay, it's a large majority of the room, okay? Somebody once told me that this book was the most important book written in this century. And I said, what did you learn from it? They said, well, is our students learning? Nope. How come? They don't want to, and their faculty don't want them to either. Now, I know the authors really well. They're very well-respected sociologists. I have a lot of respect for them. I dug into the book several times now. It's based on a study of 24 institutions. They're mostly private institutions. The students there are relatively advantaged. But there's a lot of important detail missing about the students in that study. And one of the things that's missing that I point out in my book doesn't seem to have stopped the authors from telling a story that they think makes sense. They told a story in the pages of the New York Times about how we needed to do more to push Pell Grant recipients, people from low-income families receiving financial aid, to really focus on learning, because clearly the Pell fails to do that, as evidenced by academically adrift. I was confused when I read this story. It sounded like one of those stories I'd heard before, though, right? The problem being that students are having trouble paying for college because they don't exert enough effort, they're not sufficiently motivated, they're there for other reasons, they're paying for the party, right? Except when I dug in, I noticed they didn't actually have any information on whether a student in their study received the Pell Grant. Didn't stop them from telling the story, and didn't stop people all over the country from accepting the story. Now, very different, non-scientist, non-researcher, but somebody who likes to pontificate a lot. My dear friend Kevin Carey, Audrey Waters and I wrote a critique of that book. If you haven't seen it, it was a lot of fun to write. His basic argument, I think, you all probably read it in a certain way. I read it in another way. I read it as an argument that said, look, if people can't afford college these days, and if not enough people can access it in the current model, well, then let's solve it by changing the model. Let's just do it differently. And I have a problem with that, because these millennials, and many of their counterparts who are older than them, are not after a different model. They're after what we got, okay? Chloe Johnson's route to a decent life is not through purely online education that's done in a fast, cheap, or out-of-control manner. Cheap isn't always good, okay? But the narrative about what these students want and what we're going to give them is being shaped by books like these. They are blind, we are blind all the time to the real reasons why, if learning is not occurring, why, in fact, it is not occurring. So, what does it look like to try to do better than that, to try to dig in, to try to get to the truth? Well, what most colleges and universities do is they field surveys of their students. And it's understandable, we do it in our classrooms too sometimes, right? If you really want to understand your students, you ask them some questions. There are a lot of challenges with that. One of those challenges is that depending on who's asking the questions, the students are often scared to reveal the truth. Another major problem is that when it doesn't work out for a student at a school, the school asking them questions about why it didn't work out, it just doesn't go well. We usually lose a student as a college at the end of the time in which they are enrolled. We never hear from them afterwards. The other part is, as scientists, we've been sort of told the kinds of questions that are appropriate to ask and things that are not appropriate to ask about college students. So if you look at the national surveys that are done, financed by the US Department of Education, we've got surveys going back to the 1970s. And they tell us in a lot of ways about what college is actually supposed to be like, what we're supposed to be teaching, and who our students are. Because they ask a lot of questions about things like social cohesion activities. Who do you hang out with? How many activities you're in? What clubs are you in? How often do you see an advisor or a faculty member? How many hours are you in class? Right? These reflect the normative assumptions about what higher education looks like. And those questions have changed very, very little over time. There is not a question on those surveys that digs into the issues that I'm going to be talking about in a couple of minutes. Nowhere on there do they ask if students have their basic needs met so that they can learn. Questions that are asked of K-12 students to the extent that they are surveyed at all. Because we have decided what forms legitimate inquiry and understanding of college students and what either isn't legitimate or is unnecessary. My team has taken a very different stance to this. We figured that in this case, basic R&D was necessary, right? We didn't know what we didn't know. And when you don't know what you don't know, you go out there with a very blank canvas and you just start to get to know people. We got to do that with a group of Pell Grant recipients. So these folks in some ways were very typical. They were 18 years old when they started college. They were all growing up all over Wisconsin. This is a study that I began when I was an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But these students were from all over the state, rural areas, urban areas, north, south, all over at all 42 public colleges and universities. And when they started college, they did do that one extraordinary thing that qualifies you for the Pell Grant. It's this little thing called the FAFSA. Does anybody have experience with this small American bureaucratic tragedy? No. This thing's a disaster. It has rightfully gotten critiqued. It has rightfully been attacked by both the left and the right. But it's hardly the only barrier that students face in paying for college. But I want to admit to you that everybody that we got to know did the FAFSA. And that should tell you about the people we didn't get to know, the people I'm not talking about here today in the same detail, people who we do need to know more about. Right? So there are large numbers of students who do not have the documentation required to complete the FAFSA for many reasons. Sometimes it's because they can't get it from their parents. Okay, so I got to know a certain swath of folks, and we got to know them by doing surveys that were broader than usual, by collecting their administrative records, which means all sorts of things ranging from their financial aid packages and their FAFSA forms to their college transcripts. But then, really importantly, we got to sit down for interviews with a large number of them repeatedly and over time. And we continued to get to know them whether or not they stayed in school. So it's a very different point of view than you have as a teacher in a classroom, where you see somebody for a semester or maybe a year if you're really lucky. They walk out the door and maybe you see them again on campus sometime. Right? We saw the same people as they went through life, regardless of the classes they took or the schools that they stayed in, even the states that they continued to reside in. So Chloe Johnson, and I'll tell you in a little bit more about how this happened, but she didn't last very long in Wisconsin. And when she moved to Florida, I bought a plane ticket and I followed her. Not in a creepy way, I promise you. Doesn't sound really good. But so I could sit down across the table from a so-called college dropout. That was a really big moment. I had in my head, I have to admit, as a college professor, all sorts of judgments for Chloe. I was trying to hold them back, but I figured I was ready for a really sad story, right? I was ready to hear all about failure. I was ready for her to cry. I thought she was going to tell me how she missed her college. No, she looked like I did when I left UW-Madison and went to Temple University and couldn't stop smiling for weeks. Because needs that were never being met before were finally being met. And one of the things that was being met for Chloe was that she finally had what she called 3 squares a day. She had enough to eat because she wasn't using all of her existing and available resources to pay for things like tuition. We would have had no other way of knowing. Now, why are things like that happening to people like Chloe, who you can see have very basic and modest needs in their lives? Well, it's because of something that I call the new economics of college. The old economics of college are framing the stories that we tell ourselves. The stories that say it's mainly about tuition, that say if we freeze tuition, things will be better for us, that say it's about the teachers, etc. That's not the story. Today, there are 3 things happening. Number 1, very high college prices, and that's true whether you look at the sticker price, which the wonks will tell you to ignore because we have financial aid available, or the net price, which is the price after all grants and scholarships. Both of those prices are at their highest point ever. At the same time that families, and this includes middle-class families, right? And that's a change. The working class in this country has not been in good shape economically for a long time, but the middle class is sort of newly in trouble. They're having difficulty getting ahead year after year. It's no longer the case that a daughter or son can expect to earn more than their parents. Those things have shifted. And finally, we also have to acknowledge that all of that's happening at a time when our public colleges and universities lack resources, and not by accident, right? This is the result of a neoliberal regime that has said that public education is a threat. It has raised prices at the same time that it has pulled back on the resources for schools. Put those things together and then stick people like Chloe in the middle. They don't know what happened. Most of the people around them don't know what happened, and they're just trying to go to school. So I'm going to just give you one statistical illustration of these problems, and here I'm going to pick on the Pell Grant. Now, I want to admit it's a dangerous time to pick on the Pell Grant. Part of me hates that if anybody would tweet, Sara Goldrick-Rab thinks the Pell Grant sucks, that it could be used to further the agenda of the folks in Congress and in the White House who are trying to defund this program. Okay, I don't like that. But I also want to stand by the students. And the fact is, the Pell Grant has not been living up to its promise for decades. Okay, when this program began, when it was created by the senator from Rhode Island, he said family income should not determine college attainment. And the way to do that is to offset low family income with good, generous grant aid. This makes sense. Basically, you don't have money, here's money. The Pell Grant was therefore supposed to cover 100% of the cost of attending a public 4-year or 2-year. It was also supposed to make a big dent if you went to a private university. But as you can see, it has hardly done so, right? Even way back when it started, it wasn't at 100% for public universities. And the slide over time has been rather substantial. Okay, it's the effective purchasing power. We take the maximum amount of the grant and we compare it to the price of college. And we get the resulting, essentially, coupon value. That's another way of thinking about this. Now, the really big problem here is not only has this happened, but most people in this country don't know about it. So what you know instead are things like we spend over $30 billion a year funding the Pell Grant. You might have also read that there are more Pell Grant recipients today than there have ever been before. You might have seen under the last administration, President Obama increases the Pell Grant, fights to increase the maximum. He had a huge war on his hands just in order to get that to happen. And all of those things are true. Spending is high, there's a lot of people receiving it, and the maximum amount is higher than it's been in the past. But none of those things means that this isn't also true. And this is what matters to the students. The students don't care that there's a lot of other Pell recipients, and the students don't care that it costs tens of billions of dollars to fund it. They care about the value of it. And even when President Obama increased it, it didn't increase as fast as the rest of the costs of college were going up. The real problem with this is that the message we send, do the FAFSA, there's aid available, leads students to believe the Pell Grant will really cover things. It also really leads the middle class to believe that at least somebody is really getting money for college, right? I'm on this board, I think it's called Paying for College on Facebook, and I'm watching parents all over the country who are trying to figure out how to game the system so they can get a Pell Grant. Like getting the Pell Grant is really going to make college affordable, okay? At the most harsh, one way to describe this is you get a Pell Grant and it is your invitation to take on debt. And that's how a lot of students feel about it, but they don't know that until they're sitting in your classrooms. They don't really know that it doesn't cover their costs until they've already bought into the system, already become part of it, and then found themselves short. If they want to exit, the saddest part is there's nothing to return. They can't get their money back. That's why I refer to this as a betrayal. So here's Chloe. Chloe's mom, following her divorce, had a whole lot of debt owed to lawyers. The FAFSA doesn't care about that, so it's not on the slide. But what Chloe's mom had was an income that was just over $25,000 a year. And if you put that plus a whole bunch of information on her assets and other sorts of pertinent information into the needs analysis, as it's called, it spit out an expected family contribution for Chloe of just over $2,500 a year. It's a substantial chunk of change. But if the system were working correctly, she should have then received a Pell Grant and sufficient grant aid to cover her costs. Now, her community college that year in Wisconsin cost just over $15,000 a year. I'm suspecting some of you think that's really high and you're surprised and you're thinking it's cheaper, isn't it? Well, unfortunately, when we talk about attending community college, we talk about it as if it's only tuition. But community college students face the same issues that any other student faces in that they have to cover living expenses and buy books and supplies and have medical care and get to campus with transportation. And all of those things by federal law and federal definition are part of the cost of attendance. So tuition was only just over $3,000 of that $15,000, but the real cost of attending that college, as stated by the school, was over $15,000 a year. And if the system were working properly, then Chloe would have received grant aid of just over $12,000 a year. But she didn't. As you can see, she got just under $3,000 a year, the partial Pell Grant awarded to her in 2008 under President Obama. Now you might be thinking, why didn't her college give her money? But all you need to know is that it was a community college with virtually no endowment. Why didn't the state of Wisconsin give her money? They have a state grant program. Well, yes, they do, and they very proudly talk about how much they spend on it. The problem is, it funds a small fraction of the students for whom it qualifies for, okay? And so, basically, it had run out by the time that she got there. And then you might be thinking, well, shame on Chloe for showing up for college in November, because you're assuming it ran out in September. But it didn't. It ran out in March that year. March, for the following fall, okay? That's how underfunded these state grant programs are, and it's typical. So here's what we learn, okay? This is lesson number 1 that I learned from the students, and they introduced me to the Wu-Tang Clan, and they introduced me to cream, okay? I really want you to think about it. I hesitate to put audio in my presentations because it always goes wrong, but I really want you to go home and listen to the song and sink in what it really means for your whole life to be structured by cash. It is all that Chloe could think about when facing the bill that I just described to you. She did everything right, and yet cash literally did rule everything around her as she began college, or more to the point, the lack of cash. Now, living expenses, as I said, are the most difficult thing for people to cover when they go to college, and yet they're the thing that we dismiss the most readily. In official language, we call them non-educational costs, okay, or indirect costs. But let's put it this way, right? If you can't get there, you cannot sit in the classroom. Maybe the course is online. If you cannot pay for internet, you cannot get to the classroom. Okay? I met a young woman the other day who told me everything was good. She said, I've got it all covered. Now, I've learned that's what they say. And then you start digging in. So I started going down my list. Okay, so that means you have this covered? Yes. You have that covered? Yes. I said, do you have internet? She said, yes. I said, does it work every day? She goes, not when they didn't pay the bill. I said, how often does that happen? About every other month. So about every other month, she does not have access at home to the things she needs to be able to do in order to complete her coursework. She didn't think to mention it because it's such a regular occurrence. And that's a big thing I want to note, is that not having money for living expenses is becoming really normalized. It doesn't mean, however, that it's okay. So for those of you who've read the book already, this won't be new, but I want to tell you all about my experience as a brand new assistant professor at UW-Madison in my very first year of teaching. I want to admit right off the bat that I was hired with no teaching experience. When I say no teaching experience, I mean none. Never taught a class. I had TA'd a class and all I did was grade. Okay? So I had never really had the experience of standing up in front of people and talking with them, and all I did by the way of teaching, by the way, was lecture, because that's all I thought I knew how to do. I didn't really know there was more than lecturing, by the way, until I met Jessie. Okay, let's be honest. And then I went, what is all this other stuff? And I went to a whole DPL in Madison on like grading or like assessment, and I didn't know what that was. And I was so confused. So I just want to fully, picture this person who's at this really prestigious flagship university that costs a fortune to go to, and I'm lecturing on the sociology of education, which I think is a fascinating topic. I have a PhD in it, right? You gotta be so jazzed. And this young woman in front of me falls asleep. And at first I thought like her eyes closed and she couldn't really be sleeping, right? And I start kind of circling her. I'm walking up and down and I'm looking, no, she's snoring. Okay, all right, so I'm trying to ignore this and I have all this stuff roaming through my head. Like I wanted to be like, really? That's so uncool. You don't like me? What, am I not funny? I don't know. So I figure I'm gonna start jazzing up my lectures and I go back and the next time and I'm a little more engaging, a little more, and she fell asleep again. And I just thought, man, I am at UW-Madison, right? It's a party school. She must be out a lot. You know, I made up a million stories in my head to explain this young woman's behavior. And on the third occasion, I stopped and I went over and I tapped her on the shoulder. And she looked up at me and I said, come see me in office hours. Now, I really didn't mean to be threatening. I just was really curious. I didn't realize, by the way, as a first-generation college student who had never been to office hours, I absolutely terrified her. Right? She didn't know what I was going to do to her in office hours. Okay? I kind of like to maintain the mysteriousness of my office hours, but anyway. So by the way, now I require it. It's not optional. Office hours are mandatory. I just say up front, everybody must come to office hours and you don't have to have something to talk about. And the reason that I require it is because, well, they say students don't do non-optional. It's really not for that reason. It's because I really want to see folks one-on-one in my office. And it's because of what I learned from this young woman. Because she did come in, and she sat down across from me, and I said, what's going on? You keep sleeping in my class. She said, I'm sorry. And then she started crying. Yeah. So I grabbed the tissue box, and I pushed it towards her, and within about 5 minutes, I understood a very different story than I had in my head. And the story was that this young woman got off work from working the graveyard shift at the local grocery store about an hour to 2 hours before my class began. She worked all night, many nights of the week, to pay the tuition to sit in my classroom. Now, I worked in college, okay? I waited tables, often as late as 2 o'clock in the morning. But there's still distance between 2 o'clock in the morning and a 10 a.m. class, not 2 hours, which with the commute, barely gives you enough time to eat something. I didn't have a clue, and I didn't know how to respond, right? In one sense, I thought, is that my problem? There was a little bit of that. Another thing was, gosh, I'm really sorry that's happening, but there's nothing I can do about it, right? And I said, again, I'm really sorry this is happening. I'm not sure what to do about it. That's what I said. And then I sent her away, and I went home that night, and I thought about it, and I thought, I know what to do. I'll give her a job. I'd never made a job before. I had a little bit of research money. I thought, let me figure out how to make a job. I can hire her. Now, this is not a structural solution. I want to be clear. I could not do this all the time. But I really did think, I know how to, I think I can do that. And so I went and I called the department administrator, and I said, how do I make a work-study job? And she told me. And then I realized, by the way, that as a faculty member, I was never given information on how to use my research dollars to make work-study jobs that help low-income students to get through college. I had no idea, so I learned how to do it. I made her a job. She quit the condition of her job, and maybe this is too heavy-handed, but I said you have to quit the other one, right? And I made sure that I replaced her wages. And she worked for me, learning how to survey community college students nearby. She completed her degree, and she went on to a master's degree in education policy. Okay? The biggest hurdle for her, in my view, in many ways, was me, the professor, judging her. Me, the professor, not being able to get over myself and my own ego to go figure out that she needed help and to see her for what was really going on. Just think about whether students ever fallen asleep in your class and what you might have missed. Okay, I look for them constantly now. Another huge issue the students taught us is about the ways in which financial aid not only misunderstands American families, but insults American families. So let's go back to Chloe for a sec. As I told you, her mom had just gotten divorced and she had all kinds of debt from her lawyer. And she was told that the expected family contribution, this is the official language, EFC, expected family contribution, was over $2,000, and that meant that she was expected by somebody, by the government, to pay it on behalf of her daughter. But she couldn't. She did not have that kind of money. Now, Chloe was an entrepreneurial girl who decided to solve her own problems, and so she went and found the most valuable item that she had. She grew up on a farm. She was in college to become a veterinary technical assistant because of her love for animals. And she found her horse and she sold him. Now she got $1,000 for that, but what she also figured out was even that was not enough. And what we see now all the time are students basically going to take on loans on behalf of their parents who can't afford to pay the expected family contribution. Even more so, we see the money flowing in the opposite direction. So this is a quote from a guy named Ian Williams, again, 18-year-old who's in college while realizing that not only can his mother not pay his expected family contribution, but his mother has expectations and needs of her own. Okay, they grew up in Milwaukee, came out of Milwaukee public schools, one of the most impoverished and segregated school systems in the nation. It's amazing that he got there. He had a bunch of siblings. It's amazing that mom was able to even scrap together enough to get him through high school. And so coming out of that situation, when mom expressed during college that she needed some money to cover her utility bills, that she needed some money to keep the refrigerator running, that she needed some money to fix her car, Ian was there to provide it. Far from an expected family contribution, this was an expected contribution from the child to the parents. And he says, and you can see this in his quote, it feels both good and bad to do this. I'm sure we've all done things for our parents we feel conflicted about, but this is a whole special kind of conflict because we've sent him a very specific narrative about the way things are supposed to be. He is supposed to get money from his parents. He's not supposed to be giving money to his parents. He's supposed to spend his student loan dollars on things like textbooks and laptops. He's not supposed to be spending it on his mom. If he confesses anything like he did up here to his institution, let alone to his financial aid officer, he could find himself in trouble. These are the private troubles that the students are wrestling with and the stuff that they cannot disclose. Now, I just talked a little bit about work, talked about graveyard shift work. Students are working in all kinds of ways now. And I know that you've heard stories about employment. You've heard stories about students are working more and more, and you've probably really heard stories about hours, right? Students are working longer hours. We have more full-time students in college today than we have in the past. But that is still not even the real story. The real story of what's happening to college students today is the same story as what's happening to our low-wage workers throughout this country, and especially to our part-time workers. Right? Work has been restructured in ways that benefit the employer, not the employee. And so the real story of work in college is that you can't get enough work from a single employer. So Chloe, after selling the horse and still not having enough money for college, she looked at those loans that were being offered to her. She was really hesitant to take them. I think it's understandable. We call it in official terms loan aversion. I call it mom has debt, she can't pay off from her lawyer, and I don't think this is a good idea, right? It's just very kind of basic, emotional, kind of common sense. Don't want to take it on. So instead, she decided that she would work 30 hours a week while she went to school. She also knew, like students do, although we presume they don't know, that if she went through school faster, she would finish faster, which means she decided to take 18 credits. Okay, now I can hear from the noises that you're thinking that's not so good, but I mean, think about it. Think about it on its face, right? 18 hours a week in school and 30 hours a week of employment is 48 hours. It does add up. I mean, right, a lot of us work way more than 48 hours a week. So I kind of get where she was coming from. But what she didn't know was that no single employer was going to give this college student 30 hours a week of employment. She was going to have to work for two different folks. And that work would be in two different locations, neither of which was at her college. So she began the driving, right? The commuting between her home and the first job and school and the second job and school and then back home. She's getting home at midnight. She's got to get up at 6 a.m. and do it all over again each day. And if she misses class, well, her grades would go down. If she misses work, well, she loses the job that she's using to pay for class. These are the tensions. And they result in exactly what you would expect. They result in the head bob and sleeping in class. She's sleeping in precisely the class for which she is working so hard to pay for. Okay, this is happening all the time. Work just doesn't work as a strategy like it used to. And even if you work 40 or 50 hours, you cannot replace all the financial aid that has really diminished in its purchasing power over time and compete with the increasingly rising prices of college. And finally, the last thing they taught us was just how hard it is to find help. Now, I doubt there's a college graduate in this room who didn't have to get help from somebody at some point, including probably financial help, right? Even if everything's paid for, even if your mom and dad say, everything is cool, we got it, you still probably found yourself short at some point with something, okay? Even with working my way through college, even with some tuition subsidy, because back then my mom was an adjunct and got free tuition. Good old days. Okay. Even with all that, I would sometimes fall a couple $100 short. And so I'd pick up the phone and I'd call my grandfather. And I'd get a little lecture and a bunch of Jewish guilt, and I'd get my money. Okay? If only every student had somebody like that to call. We're finding that increasingly with more and more need, there's less and less support and less help. And that's what adds up to this crisis that Sean referred to in my introduction, a crisis of what our colleagues in California have termed basic needs insecurity. Basic needs insecurity is essentially captured, Psych 101 by Maslow. If you don't have a sufficient place to live, secure food, water, and shelter, you're gonna have trouble doing all this laudable stuff that we place as outcomes of higher education. Right? You're going to learn critical thinking skills, and you're going to develop an identity, and you're going to engage in social cohesion activities, right? You're going to form your social networks, and you're going to get your lovely returns to college. You aren't going to be able to do those things, Maslow and many others have taught us, if you do not have your basic needs secured. And many of these students do not. So I want to get really clear about what these terms mean, because when I said food insecurity, when I said basic needs insecurity, I just have a feeling that ramen popped into the heads of at least a few of you. Okay, I get it. We've been doing ramen as a diet for college students for a long time. But if you eat ramen every day, I am actually not calling you hungry. Okay, because even though ramen is not exactly satisfying and doesn't meet our nutritional standards, and you can worry about sodium, right? It still does involve food that you can eat every day and you've obtained in a socially appropriate manner. Ramen, you go to the store and you buy. Dumpster diving behind the college cafeteria is not a socially appropriate way of securing food. It is very unfortunately becoming a way in which our students obtain food to eat. Housing insecurity does not mean that you have a lot of different friends and you party and so you couch surf. That is the stereotype, and I deal with it every time I try to talk to college administrators about this issue. They have in their heads lots of fun. What I have in my head is not fun at all. Right? It means that you're constantly facing the threat of eviction because you're not paying your rent or utilities. Things are being shut off. It may mean that you are indeed couch surfing, but that couch surfing is about calling different people and asking them if you can stay for a little while. It's about doubling up. You might think doubling up sounds like having a roommate. What I'm talking about here is doubling up that looks like a family with way too many people in it plus friends living in a very overcrowded apartment where your bed is the cot on the floor next to the foot of your father's bed. That's the sleeping situation of a 19-year-old that I met recently. Okay, those are the sorts of things. Now, I've been distinguishing between housing insecurity and homelessness. We could call it near homelessness and homelessness. And I've been using a very restrictive definition of homelessness precisely because of all the stereotypes held by higher education. So when I say a student is homeless, what I mean is that they have been sleeping on the street, in an abandoned building, in a shelter, in a car, in no place with any regularity. Okay, think about that as the most severe situations. Now, it's while we were getting to know these millennials that we started to get to know these issues. I had absolutely no idea that this was going to be happening to us, and over time, because that was not originally a study of basic needs and security, we've developed those studies. We've now conducted 6 of them, and I'm happy to say sort of happy to say, it's kind of not really happy news, that last week the Urban Institute came out with a nationally representative study. It's not really nationally representative, but they said it was, and it confirmed all of the findings that I'm going to describe now. Okay. The most recent survey is the one that Sean described earlier. This represents a major expansion of our work. It has been very hard to get colleges and universities, especially the presidents, to let us come in and ask these sorts of questions of students. Okay? Some of them say, what's the point? Because what's the point of finding out your students have these challenges if you don't have the resources to serve them? Others of them say, do you think we really want to be known for this? Right? They have images and reputations to protect. Others of them just simply can't believe that this is what we're even talking about. But over time, they've gotten to become more and more friendly to us, at least coming in and trying to assess what's going on. And we did get 70 community colleges last year to partner with us. Here's what we found. 33,000 students answered our surveys. Okay, that was a tiny fraction of the people that we surveyed. Some people, therefore, say low response rate survey. You're going to overestimate the problem. And I keep looking at them going, how's that? If you're a homeless college student, do you think you're really jumping at the chance to do an online survey with no incentives? It's not framed as a survey of homelessness. It's framed as a survey about just regular college students. And you're probably a little busy. And that's why these numbers scare me. Because 33,000 of these students had at least some measure, some level of food insecurity. Now, for some of them, it was very sort of light. The ramen thing comes out as being minimally food insecure. Okay? But if we go to the lowest or very low levels, which experts typically use in the regular population, then we find 56% of those students are food insecure, and 1/3 of them have the very lowest levels of food insecurity, which is associated with hunger. We further find that half of all of those students are housing insecure, and I've already described the sorts of things there that we're counting, and among those students were 14% who were homeless. Okay, now our prior survey conducted the previous year with 10 community colleges found 13%. That's the extent to which these estimates are becoming increasingly convergent and precise. Okay. The study that came out last week was about 4-year and 2-year students. It was not about homelessness, it was about food insecurity. And in case you're wondering about 4-year schools, it added some useful information. There is certainly plenty of evidence of food insecurity at our 4-year colleges and universities, including our private colleges and universities, although not to the same extent as at our community colleges. But it does appear to be the case that this basic needs insecurity is everywhere. So we had some hypotheses, like, for example, well, we would think this would be happening in LA, but maybe not in Wisconsin. Right? You can think about places that cost more, places where you see the homeless being visible, for example. And the data just simply don't bear that out. We certainly do see a little bit more homelessness, for example, among our community college students in the West and the Northeast. But as you can see, those numbers are still awfully high across the board. Same thing goes for the food and housing insecurity overall. And as a further surprise, it doesn't actually look like simply knowing, for example, how many Pell recipients you have on campus, right, will tell you whether or not you have a lot of this problem. Now, I thought that was really interesting. One of the reasons, I think, is because, for the reasons I described earlier, the Pell Grant does a really lousy job of capturing a family's need, right? So that expected family contribution is the driver of the Pell Grant, and yet you can see that it's not accurate. So you have plenty of middle-class families, for example, who think they have the resources for college, or who the government thinks they have the resources for college. They send the student off to college, and the student falls short. I had a woman in my office at Temple within a month of arriving who was one of those students. Okay? She's sitting across the desk from me. She said, I heard about you. I saw you on The Daily Show, and I got to tell you something. I've been stealing from the local grocery store. I'm looking at a woman who could be my daughter. Right? And she's horrified at what she's doing. She's embarrassed. She says, can you help me? I can't tell my mom. She says, the problem is I got caught, and now I can't go back. So I don't know how to get food. And I've now met her mother. And her mother is horrified and embarrassed and fighting with the aid office to try to get her daughter more resources. And the money is not forthcoming because by federal definition, this family does not need money. But some students are clearly, oh, that slide does not look good at all. Series 1, no idea what that means. Okay, the orange is the Pell Grant, and the Series 1 is the non-Pell Grant. The have children, the Series 1 is the not have children. This has never happened, but anyway, what you can see here is that some groups are at greater risk for homelessness, okay? And in some ways, in a totally predictable fashion. So yeah, foster care, former foster youth are at greater risk from homelessness. Anybody who knows our foster care system cannot be surprised. But the levels there, I mean, 30% of the former foster youth who answered our surveys were homeless. That really suggests something's very broken in very bad ways. And it's affecting, of course, not only the things that we talk about with foster care, right? Like how a student is even faring in high school and the odds of graduating from high school, but it's even affecting them while they're in college if they're so lucky as to make that transition. Now, when I said before help was hard to find, I talked about, things like calling your grandfather, right, or calling a person. But let's remember that this country has a social safety net. Well, it had one. It's in tatters, but in some sense it exists, and our tax dollars are going to support it, right? So we have, for example, food stamps, right? The SNAP program is very important support. We have the National School Lunch Program that feeds our children all the time with a free lunch. I know Secretary DeVos doesn't believe there's such a thing as a free lunch in this country, but every single student in Philadelphia is able to get one, and we don't even have to fill out a piece of paper. Okay, it is an incredibly important form of support, and yet, as you can see here, very few of the students that we surveyed who need these forms of support are getting them. First, we have to know that. Then, of course, we need to know what to do about that, and I'll be talking about that in just a couple of moments. So what does this feel like for our students? They feel ashamed. They feel isolated. As you could hear from telling you about the Temple student, they feel lonely. They feel unable to reach out. And at the very worst, they feel hopeless, right? It is very hard for them, they say all the time, to concentrate on class, to do their homework, etc., under these conditions. And yet, I want to tell you, one of the most striking findings from that survey that we did recently came from the questions we asked about how they use their time. So we know things, for example, about how much time they're spending looking for work. And we know, by the way, that homeless students and non-homeless students are actually employed and looking for work at very similar rates, right? It's not from lack of trying that these folks are homeless. But what really blew me away was that the number of minutes they spend in class and doing academic work was the same, regardless of whether or not they were homeless. And I think that really speaks, number one, to how special they are. And I say special, I should say select, right? These are not regular homeless people. Regular homeless people don't go to college at very high rates. These are our students who already made it in the door, who already did all that paperwork, who already went through those admissions processes to be in our classrooms, who already took those tests, right? And so they are fighting very, very hard in order to be in school, while at the same time enduring conditions that I think few of us can probably imagine. So we can do better than this. We have to do better than this. I doubt that I have to convince anybody in this room of that. So let me give you some ideas for what you can do. The first thing you need to do is to start really actively listening. And if you need strategies for active listening, Google will turn up plenty. Okay, but it starts by closing your mouth. Okay, I'm a talker. This is a hard thing for me. I had to retrain my whole research team to stop asking questions and just to start listening. The other really good part about active listening, the other thing that really works, if you think you know the question to ask, you probably don't. Follow their emotions. If they're upset about something, go where that is. That's going to lead you probably to the source of the challenge faster than your little checklist in your head about what their likely challenges are. Place your commitment on the syllabus. See, it's so funny, I forgot I made a slide on this. And yet some of you know who did virtually connecting with me earlier today that this morning I was sitting around getting ready for this keynote, and I was also finishing my syllabus for my first course at Temple this fall. And I looked and I thought, oh, something's missing. I have 2 weeks on basic needs insecurity for these student affairs practitioners, and yet nowhere do I state on the syllabus that I want to know that their needs are secured. And so I added a short policy statement that simply says that if you're having trouble securing food or a safe place to live, you should contact the dean of students, but you should also tell me that if you're comfortable telling me It will allow me to access resources that might not otherwise be found. It's also a signal to them that I care, and it's also a signal to them that I want to have those kinds of conversations. Okay, put your commitment on your syllabus. And when you find out that it's happening, do something. Now, I am not telling you to take students home and give them a bed. I am not telling you to take students home and give them a bed. I'm saying it over and over because I am trying not to take students home and give them a bed. I co-parent with my ex-husband, so I have 2 extra beds in my house half of the week, and I meet with homeless students all the time. It is very hard to sleep after those interviews, knowing that I have beds I could give, but that is not really a solution, okay? It's not. It's just going to contribute to essentially more couch surfing. What we have to do is connect them to the resources that can get them housed. I'll give you some of those in a moment. Prepare to engage with those students as learners by developing the connections with the people who can actually satisfy those conditions. Okay, now sometimes that means asking yourself not only if you know the policies to prepare your syllabus, but if you know the dean of students, right? If your university is not introducing you, then send them a note and just say, I expect to be ready for any student who comes to my classroom, so please just let me know what kinds of resources do you have available, so I'm ready when it happens. And if you didn't do that, because I know how busy we can all be when you're preparing a class, when it comes and it's there in front of you, know that it's your right to contact them, and that is exactly what they are there for. And if they don't have an answer, ask them when they will have one. The first time I called the UW-Madison Dean of Students and said, I have a homeless student here, what do I do? She said, we don't have homeless students. I said, yes, we do. Do you have resources? No, the community has resources. I said, you have till tomorrow, and then I'm going to call the newspaper. It works. That's kind of what I do. And guess what? I called the newspaper the next day. The reporter called her. And she gave the reporter a list of new resources that we had on campus. I said, well, that works. Look, public embarrassment, it works with universities. Okay, I didn't have to give a student's name. I just said, I'm ready to hand over this student for a story. You know, it didn't come to that, luckily, but literally inspire them to take action. Okay, these are the things you want to know about. All right, you want to know whether you have emergency aid on campus. You want to know who has it. How do you get it if a student needs it? It could be small pots of money. It could be with your department chair. It could be with your dean. It could be in the dean of students' office. You don't know where it is. But just whenever you meet those sorts of folks on campus, just ask. Okay, I do have colleagues who are beginning to provide that sort of stuff on their own. If you feel like you're somebody who can stock your office with granola bars, right, do it. Hand them out to anybody who needs them if you want to do that. If you feel like you want to give out cash, although I'm really not recommending it because then you're going to be known as the person who has the cash, okay, you know, you can do that. But people do a large number of things. I'll tell you one thing one colleague does that you might not think of, tampons. Okay, if you Google after this, if you're interested in this topic, Google bustle, homeless, and tampons, and you will come up with the best video I have seen in a long time of what it is to be a homeless woman and to try to deal on a regular basis. Can you imagine if that young woman is sitting in your classroom and she couldn't afford a box? Okay, just make it known to people that you are friendly in this sense. I don't know that we need to have a triangle or whatever else we're going to put on our doors to signal this. Word of mouth will do it at this point. There should be, and there will increasingly be, across this country, a case management specialist on your campus. There is a growing number of them around the country. Many of them are social workers. Okay? They should be located on campus. You should not be asking a student to leave the confines of the campus to go deal with the regular bureaucracy in your community, because they will not be well treated and they probably will not be well served. So having that case management person on campus is something we need to ask for, and once they're there, you need to know their number. Usually it's somebody in the dean of students' office who can do these things. Follow your students' lead. Some of the students are way ahead of us in figuring out that this is a problem because they see it among their friends. They see it among their roommates. They know what's going on, and so they are taking action. So the College and University Food Bank Alliance formed in 2012 and had about 5 members at the time. Claire Cady, who now works with me at Temple University, was one of the co-founders. And Claire told me a couple months ago that she had amazing news. There are now 506 members of CUFBA. Okay, that's about 1 out of every 8 colleges and universities in the United States. That includes the for-profits and all the others. And the vast majority of those are pantries that were created by students. They are often, by the way, funded by students. Students are leading on this, and what our job to do as faculty is to elevate their work. It's to put it out in front of other people, it's to say that it matters, it's to thank them for doing it, whatever of those things you feel you can do. It's also to insist that at some point the institutions institutionalize it. Right? It isn't a good or safe idea, frankly, to allow or force undergraduates to have to fund these things themselves, because at some point, some student government's going to come along and doesn't want to do it. Right? And that's the point at which the rug gets pulled from underneath these important things. The resources are scarce in most places, but the potential for partnership is always there. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. This fall, I'm embarking on a new research project where we're studying these partnerships in multiple places. One of the coolest ones is in Tacoma, Washington, where the Tacoma Community College has a large number of homeless and near homeless students. And so, with the help of its local housing authority, it's begun to give those students access to subsidized housing vouchers. It is paid for by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That money's not coming out of that under-resourced community college, nor is it really coming from the housing authority. This is federally funded stuff. Okay? Another cool one is in Houston, Texas, where the Houston Community College is partnering with the Houston Food Bank, not to stock the food pantry, which is a sort of last-ditch emergency effort, right, where a student doesn't have food and so they go there and they get whatever's available. The Houston Food Bank is proactively providing food scholarships. We're going to be letting students know, and I'm so pleased that this has finally happened. We're going to say to students as they enter Houston Community College this fall, hey, we know groceries are expensive. We know that's on your mind. Let's take that off of you. We've got your groceries. You will get deliveries every 2 weeks of a sufficient amount to meet your needs, and you will get them as long as you stay in school. Okay, it's a very different message. And I'm really excited for the Houston Community College Financial Aid Office, who's going to get to tell students this and probably going to get some gratitude, probably for the first time in a while. I think this is perhaps the thing that you're best equipped to do as educators. Tell people about this. Teach people about this. When you finally do meet a student, if you have not already, who has disclosed their story to you, do in a confidential way that does protect that student. Do pass that on. Do tell other people so they know that those stereotypes of millennials are nothing but stereotypes. These folks are real, and they're dealing with issues that I think make them very different than prior college students. Now, I have a colleague who recently said he expects that in the future youth homelessness to decline. And he said it was because this seems to be a millennial thing. Ooh. It's not a millennial thing except for this. The millennials are bearing the brunt of our austerity policies. It's the millennials who are the first generation to go to college after their mothers, who used to get cash assistance for raising them, were told that going to college was not an acceptable way to pursue a better life. Right? That happened in 1996. Look where we are. We're 20 years out. And we've got folks whose families have been cut off from the system who are going to be going through this, even as we have told them that college is for all. Even as we've told them that if you don't go to college, you've got nothing in front of you. Here are some things that if you want to do more than that and you want to lift up some policies and practices that you can advocate for. Access to public benefits is more restrictive for college students than it is for other adults. If you want to get food stamps and you don't have a child, you have to work 20 hours a week, and those 20 hours a week, that work requirement cannot include working at college. Okay? If you are living in public housing, if you grew up in public housing with your parent, and then you enroll in college, you may quickly find out that you have to move because people in college do not count for many public housing authorities. Okay? We met a young woman who had to switch to part-time precisely for this reason, because if she did not, she and her mother would have to vacate the unit. We can expand the National School Lunch Program. This is such a no-brainer. Don't you think ag would love it? Right? That's why we have the program in the first place. It was supposed to be about nutrition. It's not. It's about money. It's not as high quality as we need it to be. It doesn't do everything that we need it to do. But boy, oh boy, that chocolate milk in the morning, it makes it possible for some kids to learn. We also need to do things like Fight for 15. Okay? These are movements that have got to be joined. We do not have enough educators admitting their students could afford to be in their classrooms and perform better if only work actually paid again. And finally, as was stated in the introduction, I am a proponent of free public higher education. Now, it's not because I believe that will solve all income inequality in higher ed or all racial inequality in higher ed. No one policy will do everything. But it will begin to establish a new framework for thinking about how we finance education at all levels. We made high school free because we couldn't afford not to make high school free. We couldn't face a nation that didn't have those additional skills and that time spent in school. Okay, we can make the argument an economic one. We can make the argument a moral one. We can make, at this point, an argument about saving our democracy. That's where we're at. We have a lot of very angry people in this country who were told to go to college and went, and when it didn't work out, found themselves in situations like these. These folks are not walking around saying, let's expand the safety net. These folks are walking around saying, government screwed us. We need to give them something to believe in again. And the way to do that is to make a system that readily welcomes them back in to finish what they started and a real shot at completion. Now, I do run something called the Wisconsin Hope Lab, and when I first started using the word hope, I worried that it was a little bit naive. Well, that was 2010. No, that's not quite right. That was 2013. At this point, in this world, it's even harder to have hope. But I actually think it's even more important. There is a Harvard business professor who says this is nonsense. Hope is not a strategy. That's because he thinks that we mean all we'll do is hope. The problem with a lack of hope, which is what our students are facing, is it makes it awfully hard to get up in the morning. It is not exactly the most uplifting research agenda that I've got right now, okay? It can be very hard to go from interview to interview to interview, to see all these problems, to realize how broken this system is in shards around very good people who are just trying to get an education. But if we don't believe we will do better than this, then we will not do better than this. Two last things. I do think it's important, and I've discovered it's very important to give people something they can do very quickly if you need to do something right away after you've learned about these problems. This past year, with the help of folks like Tressie McMillan Cottom and many others, I created a new nonprofit, and we're administering a fund that we call the FAST Fund. The FAST Fund is emergency aid for students like those I just described, except instead of giving money to their universities to implement bureaucratic processes like waiting periods for receiving emergency aid, okay, we are giving the money to the faculty. It's faculty and students together. That's how you distribute money quickly. We give it to them, no strings attached. And we do it at 3 schools a year. This past year, we did it in 2 different areas of Wisconsin, and we did it in Boston. This coming year, we're doing it in North Carolina, Ohio, and in Long Beach, California. And there's more information about that on my website. And finally, we are closing the Wisconsin Hope Lab. I want to give you a heads up. Closing it next summer and reopening in the fall with an evolution, which is going to be called the Hope Center for College Community and Justice. It's going to go beyond the affordability issue, because I think, and I hope you can see here, this is beyond affordability, right? This is about people's basic rights. This is about structural parts of our system that don't work well together. This is about what higher education is and what it can be. And those are the kinds of issues we're going to be working on. So thank you so much for your time. I look forward to your questions.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions or so. So if you have any questions, I'll run this mic around and you guys can ask. What questions do you have?
I'm very curious about when you say you're going to look at more than just financial security. I know of a student who tried to commit suicide simply because of visa regulations. And knowing that despite getting 4.0s, despite getting all kinds of accolades, that the time is up and one has to leave the country because one cannot be in this country legally. And if somebody doesn't want to be illegal, then you have no choice.
Yep.
Are you addressing things like that?
Yeah, so this is on our list, actually. I'm happy to say it's on our list. Doesn't mean we have the resources to do the work yet, right? That's one of the things we're looking for. There's a lot of counterproductive, this is a polite way of putting it, right? There's a lot of counterproductive things happening between policies like immigration policies, and they run counter to the goals of higher education policies and the goals of economic development, right? And people are pointing that out in droves right now, as we seem to be exporting talent left and right at a time when we need it more than ever, right? So part of what I've learned is that it is very useful to draw with kind of a laser and depth of understanding of those juxtapositions, of those points of hypocrisy, right? And to bring their attention to folks who haven't thought about them, right? It's very expensive to do things like you just described. I mean, in other words, the cost to us of that student either committing suicide, right, or that student leaving before a degree, it is costly. And those costs are not usually measured. They're usually assumed to be very personal. But they're not. They're societal. Right? So immigration reform is on our agenda. It's not a small topic to take on, especially right now. To give you a flavor of some of the other ones, for example, these issues of incarceration loom very, very large. Right? And the number of people looking at what are effective reentry programs and how will it require changing systems that work better with higher education to make those bridges happen, that work is not happening in very many spaces. The foster care work is also not happening in very many spaces. So if you think about this, if you put the student at the center and you draw a set of policies that govern their lives around them, different students and many different policies interacting with them, you'll quickly see how many other areas students have to traverse just to be able to get through college. And you'll quickly realize that most of those have not been aligned in any way with anybody who understands policy, right, to make this easier for the student. And that's the kind of work that we want to do. We're going to need lawyers to do it.
Other questions?
Thank you for sharing your information. And one of the things that stuck out for me, and I actually tweeted about it, you talked about the false narratives that are created for students, and it got me thinking about the parents and how false narratives are created on why parents are unable to match that family contribution, quote unquote. And so I was curious, and I am going to read the book, but what has been found about parents from these students?
Yeah, it's interesting because the main narrative that we tell about parents in higher education is that they're helicoptering. Right? And that's what higher ed's worried about. And there's a book out from the woman at Stanford, right, about how you shouldn't helicopter your college student too much. And boy, I've met so many students who would just love it if their parents had time to helicopter them. Right? That's just not what's going on for the vast majority. The other thing, these family relationships are very complicated, right? For most of our students, about half of all college students live at home. I'm putting that in quotes, during college. What it means to live at home is not something that I think people talk about in the way they need to when they're getting ready for college. So for example, you say, my child will live at home to save money. Well, when you run short of money, does that mean that your child needs to pay some bills? It often does. That quickly becomes the reality, but it wasn't planned for. Where that doesn't work, just to highlight, again, the sort of disconnect here, on the financial aid form, if you note that you're going to live at home, the aid office is allowed to give you no money for living expenses. Okay? The student does not know that. The student is answering honestly as to their intentions. It is not meant to imply anything about their economic circumstances. It doesn't say, will your mom and dad charge you rent? Right? Now, these are really hard conversations, though, to have. And I've thought, for example, a lot about Ian Williams' mom. Right? And if I met Ian's mom, what would I do? Like, what would I want to have? What conversation would I want to have with her? And the answer is I really don't know. right? Is it better to tell parents earlier that this stuff's happening a lot in college and we need to like at least have the conversation in advance? Or are we gonna scare people from sending their kids to college at all? Right? This is the stuff that we don't have resolved. Is this the new conversation, right, that we have about financing? It's not just about, yes, you gotta fill out the FAFSA and you gotta do it every single year, and yes, you gotta give your kids the information to do that. What I'm talking about is a lot harder than that.
I've actually had a student miss class because she was living at home, and when a younger sibling was sick, she stayed home with her younger siblings so that her mom could go to work.
Absolutely.
And so part of that staying at home is you're still part of that organic unit and expected to do things in the service of the whole family to keep it running. Where I think the general American narrative is about you go off to college and you now live your own life, and you are responsible. You know, our goal is just that you're now responsible for yourself. And so often these kids are bearing responsibilities well beyond their own individual selves.
You're right. And if they don't separate, then we say they failed to launch. I mean, like, this whole thing is about flight and floating around and being adrift. I mean, I'm amazed. That is just not how families with any sort of tightness to their resources get by, right? And we actually did this 3 different ways. We measured what students give their families in terms of time, care work, in terms of emotional support. One young woman was simply drained because she spent almost every night on the phone listening to her mom talk about her divorce, right? And you gotta take that seriously because there's a lot of drama happening to our families that also became a mental health challenge for her. And then the third part is money. And I might even think that in some ways the money is the easiest thing to give. But the other thing that we saw is there are big cultural differences in what people end up giving, right? And also, of course, fairly large gender differences as well. So I think, again, the question of what do we do with that is the next step. Now that if we can just start by admitting that it's happening, right, and not systematically disadvantaging them, and for example, in those financial aid processes, that would be a good place. But how do we better prepare families for this? Again, I'm not sure. If you have ideas, I want to hear them.
One last quick question. Can you actually hand this back?
This is just kind of an easy one, I think. How do we find out if this is happening on our campus? I mean, I know you talked about looking and being watchful in front of the classroom, but I only teach so many classes, and I'm at a small liberal arts college where the price tag is high, so it would be easy for me to say, I don't think it's a problem, but that's probably not true. There's probably a handful of students who are getting financial aid, as you talked about. So you talked a little bit about who do I talk to in the college? And then what do they need to do to know if this is a problem?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'll give you a couple different routes. I mean, the most official route is we've made the opportunity to do the survey available to anybody, and we're not charging. And we're actually looking for more funding to continue to just be able to make that available to any college that ever wants to do it, analyze the data, and give it to them. But especially elite small private colleges really are not excited about doing this, right? As you can imagine. I visited Amherst last year, though, and it took only 24 hours on campus to find 3 homeless students, okay? So, and think about that, $2 billion endowment. They do not meet full need. They say they do, but they don't. Number 1, ask students. Ask students about students, right? And don't ask, do you have housing insecure friends or food insecure friends, right? Ask, do you know people who don't regularly have a place to sleep at night? Do you have friends who, they often know about it because of the cafeteria. Friends who can't afford to have enough swipes in the cafeteria, right? So that's one. Your campus safety folks probably know if they've seen people, because they're the ones who tell them to get off benches or get out of the library. Librarians know. Librarians really know. So there's a variety of folks. You could ask the dean of students, but I have not found them to be the first to know. You know, I really would start with campus safety and with the librarian if you want to know. And then the question is, once you know, what do you do?
Okay.
Thank you
very
so
much.
I'll be here for the reception.
Okay. How's everyone feeling? Good. Okay. So we have sad. we have. So we have another thing coming up right now. In